Hi everyone, this is Reverend Josh at Boise First United Church of Christ. We're so glad you've chosen to listen to our sermon this morning. We hope that you find yourself encouraged as we meet you wherever you are on life's journey.
As we are in the fourth week of Lent now, in our series about cultivating and letting go, if you weren't with us at the beginning of the series, many of us wrote on pieces of paper that we then folded into origami and hung on this barren tree of things we wanted to cultivate as spring bursts forth and begins to come into our natural world around us, as well as the things that we want to let go in order to do that, preparing the ground for what it is that is spring bursting forth. And earlier this month, I shared with you last week that a bill was brought forward with some legislation that would have made it illegal for churches and charities and individuals to provide aid to people in the country who, or particularly in our state, who were here illegally. These were things like shelter or food, transportation, basic assistance. It was considered aiding and abetting an illegal immigrant committing a crime. And it was one thing that was encouraging, of course, was that I shared last week was that this bill did not pass committee. It did not move forward by 2 votes. But what struck me most was the testimony at this public hearing. There were 3 different individuals who testified who were immigrants who had come to the United States through a very specific process that they would have considered the right way in their speech. When they gave their testimony, they were in favor of this bill. They were in favor of it being criminal to assist illegal immigrants, which was shocking to me. It actually, quite frankly, pretty perplexing as well. But as I listened to their speech, I began to realize that their concern was that by illegal immigrants being allowed to be here and receive aid, that they were taking resources and opportunities from them. And also, one person said, and they make us look bad. They make all immigrants look bad, is what they said. Now, regardless where we land politically or on these topics, what stood out to me most was something that was deeply human, and that was something that I saw in this moment, and that was fear. Fear that dictates so much of our politics in our world. A fear that there isn't enough. Not enough opportunity, not enough resources, not enough jobs, not enough food, not enough belonging, not enough aid. It's the belief that someone else receives something, safety, compassion, grace, mercy, love, help. It must somehow mean that means there will be less available for us. It's that way of thinking. It's a scarcity mindset. Maybe many of us are familiar with that verbiage, right? Scarcity mindset is the belief that simply there isn't just enough to go around. And as I preached in my sermons many of times, I believe God has provided all of the needs, all of the resources we need on this earth. It's humans that choose to hoard that, billionaires that have way too much, or people that choose to have so much more so that others have so much little. All that we need is on this earth. And the mindset that shapes so much of this mindset shapes so much of our policy, our worldview, how we interact with each other, even the testimony of other immigrants who were warring against those who were here illegally. It quite frankly, this idea, this scarcity mindset, it shapes how we treat strangers, how we measure fairness, how we extend forgiveness even to people. Sometimes we even imagine grace that way, that there's only so much grace that we can extend to other people or that God could give out. But if love is limited and if mercy has a quota, as if someone else receiving compassion and somehow means that we will be less compassionate or have less compassion left for us, then that's a really unfortunate tension. It's a really sad world to live in. The fear that there isn't enough, it sits right at the heart of one of Jesus' most famous parables that I bet many of us probably know. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you may even be familiar with it. And that's the parable of the prodigal son. But before Jesus tells this story, which we're going to talk about today, Jesus gives us a little bit of context around the crowd that was listening to the story, because, that's probably relevant, right? Because who he's telling the story to is he's trying to communicate a specific message to them. And that will help us interpret it, perhaps. So beginning in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Verse 2, this made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. Oh, that's the line. That was too far. Dinner parties with them, that's just too far, okay? Let them cut you in the grocery line, that's all right. Maybe a head nod on the street, but dinner parties? No. Let's think about this really. I want to contextualize tax collectors and notorious sinners during that time to maybe our context today. Tax collectors were known as people who cheated people and contributed to systemic and generational poverty, because they would often go and they would say, you owe this much in taxes, but maybe you really only owed a fraction of that, and the rest of it they would take for themselves. That's actually how they got paid. The Roman government did not pay them. They were paid by just taking a little bit off the top. And if no one came down on them, they would take a little bit more and a little bit more. They contributed to systemic poverty, quite frankly, and people despised them because they were deceitful. And if you were a tax collector, most likely your family would disown you because it was a dishonorable job to have. Maybe our equivalent today, if we thought about it, would be politicians in favor of tax cuts for the billionaires. Maybe if we thought about it today, the equivalent would be Wall Street investors embezzling, only concerned about the bottom line, or maybe CEOs at the top who just continue to make more and more money while they don't let that money trickle down to the people who are also making the money possible. Or maybe it's lawyers willing to defend, not all lawyers. I know we have lots of lawyers in our church. Be very clear here. Very clear. Not all lawyers. You hear me? Understand? Okay, good. But the lawyers who are willing to defend causes they know are wrong, even if the money is right. Or maybe it's appraisers and manipulating home values and banks redlining neighborhoods in order to keep certain people out. Maybe it's law enforcement not all law enforcement, who abuse their commitment, though, and to protect and to serve. As you know, I'm not a black and white kind of person. I don't think that all people in these groups are that, but just like in any group, there are people who use the power been entrusted to them to, instead of empowering people, to gain more power for themselves. Maybe these are the tax collectors of our day, and Jesus was hanging out with them. Interesting here now, another word, sinners. Maybe we know that one a little bit more closely, right? Sinners. The Pharisees and religious leaders of the day, they considered them sinners because they were people who didn't follow Jewish law and traditions. So anybody who didn't follow their Jewish laws and traditions of cleanliness and expectation of holiness. There was this belief that if you associated with sinners, it would sort of rub off on you, or maybe take you down a dirty road, or that you needed to distance yourself from the sinners. You know this, right? Maybe your parents told you become the company you keep. This was the same idea at the time. And so maybe our equivalents, if we think about sinners, maybe our equivalent today might be politicians that we think offend us. Maybe theology that we think is dangerous and people who hold those views. Maybe sinners today might even be people we assume are irresponsible. I'm not sure who it is for you, who you would consider to be the unclean, the untouchable, the people that you should keep your distance from and cut out of your life. But my question is, maybe you can figure it out by asking the question, who would you refuse to eat with? Who would you avoid sitting next to? Who do you quietly just look down on? I think the religious leaders in our story in Luke 15, they're upset because Jesus is welcoming people they consider to be morally bankrupt. And yet Jesus is dining with them. Their complaint reveals something important. It reveals that they believe that grace should be earned, that it should be disrupted carefully or distributed carefully, and that it should be deserved. And they don't think these people deserve God's grace, love, or mercy. And yet those are the people that Jesus seems to be extending it to. And he calls them the sick at some point in his stories. Those who need him the most. Why would he not spend time with those who need him the most? But I would argue, too, that our story today reminds us that even the religious elite, perhaps they needed him even more because they didn't think they needed him. In Luke chapter 15, we know the story well, perhaps some of us. It's the story of the prodigal son. The story of an older, I'm not going to read the whole story to you, but I will tell you it's in Luke 15 if you'd like some bedtime reading. But I'll tell you the story because it's quite long. I'll tell you through my memory here. You have a younger son who decides one day that he's just doesn't want to wait any longer for his dad to die so he can get the inheritance and go off and do what he wants with it. So he says, "Dad, I really wish you were dead so I could have the money." And his dad says, "Well, I don't really want you to be waiting for that. So I'm just going to give you your inheritance now and you go and do what you want with it." And so he does. He takes it and he goes off to a far off land. We understand that he spends it on wild living, however you want to interpret that. He spends and loses all of it, finds himself sleeping in a bay of pigs, eating what the pigs are eating because he can't afford to eat anything else. And then he realizes, wow, this is a terrible life here. I've really made some poor decisions. I really should go back to my dad. And I know my dad probably would never accept me as a son again because I've really screwed up. I really messed up here. But even my dad's servants and hired hands live better than I do. Even they don't eat from the pigs. So I'll go back. I'll ask my dad, "Can I work for you?" And so he goes back. And the Bible tells us that, and Jesus tells us in this story, that as he goes back to the land where his father is, his dad sees him coming in the distance and he runs to his son. This father runs to his son who has taken the inheritance and said, "I wish you were dead so I could have your money." And before the son could ever even utter a word, the father throws his arms around his son and embraces him with love, and he calls to those who are his hired hands and says, "Bring him a robe and bring him a ring and kill the fatted calf that we have been waiting for a big reason to feast on. My son was lost and now he's found." Well, the older brother in this story, is in the fields still working. He didn't get his inheritance. He hadn't did wild living. He stayed at home and worked with his father and worked the land, and he hears a party going on. And so he asks one of the hired hands in the field, he says, what's going on back there? So you didn't hear? Your brother has come back home and your father's throwing a celebration. You got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. He's doing what? Well, yeah. He gave him a ring and he put new sandals on him and he even threw a robe over him and he killed the fatted calf. They're having a huge party. You should go join. You got to be kidding me. He got his inheritance. Everything that's left is mine. I deserve that. That's my money. That's my calf. That's my ring. That's my robe. Those are my sandals. I'm the one that stayed here and followed the rules and did things the right way. I'm the one who deserves that. And the story doesn't tell us if he joins the party. We just know that the story tells us in verse 31, his father said to him, "Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, and now he is found." Notice the timing here. The father runs before the apology even comes from his younger son. Before the younger son can even say, "I'm so sorry, please forgive me, take me back, let me be a hired hand." Before any of that happened, the father runs to the son and embraces him. There is grace enough, there is mercy enough, there is love enough, there is no strings attached here. It's just, my kid has come home. Doesn't even know if his kid's come to his senses yet, just he's come home. He may have come home to ask for more money. But he loves him. He loves him unconditionally. He lavishes him with this unlimited resource of love. The truth is, I think, though, that like both brothers, they kind of at times both of them live inside of us. The person that maybe you identify in this story, maybe you identify as like, well, I follow all the rules, and of course I deserve God's love, and of course God loves me and blesses me. I'm a good kid. I'm a good person. I deserve it. And there are others of us who have a mindset of like, I've done so much wrong in this life. I continue to mess up. I continue to make mistakes. I'm just such a screw up. Why would God ever want me as his kid again? I'll just be a servant. I'll just be glad to just be at the table. I'm not deserving. I don't know which voice you are, but David Roberts, a theologian, suggests that maybe in this story Jesus isn't the father. Maybe Jesus is actually the prodigal. Interesting. Wonder with me for a moment. We do this with our kids in children's church. It's called Godly Play, and we just ask them wondering questions. And we invite them to also share wondering questions with, I wonder this and I wonder that. So wonder with me. Look what he says here. David Roberts suggests that maybe Jesus is the prodigal son in this story for this reason. He asks them and us whether we will accept Jesus, even if he reeks of what we think is unwashed sin. You catching this for a moment? The religious leaders in this story, they didn't like Jesus because he smelt like he was mingling with sin, with the people you weren't supposed to. Look what he goes on. He asks us whether we will embrace him, unclean, unsavory, to our tastes, and with our lavish grace of a banquet. He asks us whether we will run out to meet him when we see him lost, alone, bedraggled, and abused, whether we will be eager and expectant to do the irresponsible thing of living out the good news. He asks us whether we live like the Father in the story, having the generosity to accept Jesus as he appears, or whether we, like the brother, will demand that God not be so irresponsible and insist that God come to us only in the ways we find acceptable. Interesting to pause and to think and to consider that maybe in this story, as Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son to the religious leaders, he's saying to them, just because you don't think someone is acceptable or deserving of God's love doesn't mean they aren't. You are not the standard by which that is determined. You are instead a self-righteous older brother who thinks you have all you have because you deserve it, instead of recognizing that all you have is because of God's grace and love and mercy. And that even if you, like your younger brother, ran off and did terrible things, I would still love you. I would still call you my beloved son because you are my kid. I may be annoyed with you. I may be hurt by you. I may be frustrated by the decisions that you have made in this life, but you're still my kid and I will always love you. Wow. A story of grace and mercy that would have shook the religious leaders as they heard this story told to them. Sometimes I think in this story we are the younger brother. We run, we waste, we make choices that leave us hungry, and sometimes we are like the older brother, responsible and faithful, but quietly restful, while grace is given freely. Resentful. Because grace feels unfair, and that's the point. Grace is not a transaction, church. Grace was never supposed to be a transaction. It is not measurable, but instead it is abundant. I told you the story last week about Nelson Mandela, and I want to continue that story today. Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa in 1994, and the world held its breath for nearly 50 years. South Africa had lived under apartheid, a system of racial segregation where the white minority government controlled political power and the black majority was denied basic rights. Families were separated, communities were forcibly relocated, and violence was used to maintain the system. Sound familiar? Mandela had 27 years in prison resisting that regime. And after decades of oppression, it would have been understandable that as he entered into the new government, that he would seek punishment and retribution and evening the odds and giving people what they deserve. But instead, the mass trials of retaliation did not happen. Instead, he helped establish something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What we may know now today is restorative justice. It was a national process where victims could tell their stories publicly, and those who had committed violence under apartheid could come forward and they could confess their crimes, and in some cases, if they told the truth fully, they were even granted amnesty. For many victims, this felt difficult. Forgiveness felt unfair, mercy felt undeserved, but Mandela believed something deeper was at stake at the very soul of their country. He knew that a nation could not heal if forgiveness was treated like a limited resource, something to be rationed only to the deserving. But instead, he invited them all to look inward and ask, we are all capable of evil. We have all hurt others, and we are all deserving of forgiveness and new beginnings. Mandela understood something that I think Jesus is teaching us in this parable, and that is that grace cannot operate on a scarcity mindset. It can't. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes scarcity thinking shows up surprisingly, though, in our lives, doesn't it? It shows up in how we respond, maybe when a coworker gets promoted, or how someone's life looks so perfect on social media compared to yours, or someone else's marriage turned out so much better than yours you had ever hoped or wished. Maybe it's when a sibling gets more attention or love, like we heard in our story today, or maybe it's when an immigrant gets assistance when you don't think they deserved it, but you do. Suddenly, we feel like someone else's blessing threatens ours, a scarcity mindset. But the Father in this story, I think, reminds us of this, that love is not a limited resource. Mercy and grace is not a zero-sum game, that God's mercy doesn't shrink when it is shared around, that it only grows. There's a small detail in the story that I think is quite interesting that could be easily missed upon us in our Western context. And that's when it tells us that the Father runs. In the ancient patriarchal world, men did not run, nor did they lift up their robes to do so. If they did, it was quite dishonorable. But in order to run to do so, in order to run effectively, you would have had to lift up your robes so you could get a good run in and not trip over the robes. But that's exactly what he did. As his son returns home, he hikes up his robe and he runs in an undignified manner. For a respected older man, he runs to his son to show him just how extravagantly he's there to embrace him. Because compassion outruns indignity. Compassion outruns judgment, and compassion outruns shame every time. The father in this story, I think, had to let go of pride. The younger son had to let go of independence, and the older son had to let go of resentment. Each character had something to release and something new to cultivate so that they could experience the grace and the mercy and the love of God in a way that maybe they had never before. So what does this parable invite us to do this Lent? I think it invites us to true abundance. It invites us to compassion, to forgiveness, to reconciliation. I don't know what it's inviting you to, but I hope it's inviting you to something. And then we're invited to let go of scarcity thinking and zero-sum grace and the fear that there isn't enough, or the belief that you can't do enough or you can do enough to earn God's love. There's nothing you can ever say, ask, think, believe, or do that will make God love you any more or any less than God loves you right now. Rest in that zero-sum grace. Because the truth is, church, as we have sung through Lent, there is grace enough. There is love enough. There is mercy enough for all of us. Both sons in this story are lost in different ways. One in rebellion and one in resentment. But the Father is watching the road for both of them. This week, I invite you to ask yourselves, where have you believed there isn't enough? Enough love or belonging or grace or resources? Or where have you been like the younger sibling, needing to come home, but too afraid because you didn't think you deserved it? Because the good news in this story is that the Father keeps watching the road for the dutiful child or the prodigal child, or some complicated mix of both of them some days. God already knows your road. God already knows your thoughts. And God still runs towards you anyways. Because the story of this story does not just end with a party. It ends open-ended with the question to the religious leaders, will they join the party? Will they celebrate in this grace that is extended to all people, even the people that they think are unclean? With the music playing and the table full and the doors open, the question is still hanging in the air here this morning, and it is simple. Will you join the party? Will you have dinner with those in whom maybe you wouldn't want to have dinner? That they may know that there is grace enough, there is mercy enough, and there is love enough. Let us cultivate this feast to believe that grace has already begun and we're just all caught up in it. And there is more than enough to go around. Amen? Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Boise First UCC podcast. We hope you found inspiration, encouragement, and a deeper connection to your faith and community. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we encourage you to subscribe, to leave a review, or share with your friends and family so that they can more quickly find us. Also, if you benefited from today's podcast, we invite you to make a donation at boisefirstucc.org/donate. Until next time, may you go in peace with curiosity and courage and a heart full of hope as we look toward our progressive Christian faith.